Now, reform is made easy if there is political bipartisanship, and of course it is made easy if it is accompanied by community consensus. But in the absence of consensus and bipartisanship, reform always becomes a lot harder. I think only the naive believe introducing significant national reform is easy. Some people think that all it requires is 51% of the two-party preferred vote and a bare parliamentary majority. That's the theory anyway, but that is certainly not the reality. So successful reform is always hard, and I think I know that from recent experience. It takes a belief in the need for change, and this government certainly has that. It takes ideas to promote prosperity and opportunity, and we certainly have those too. And it takes patience, and it takes persistence, and a willingness to listen so as to find the best way to take people with you. Of course, during this period as we go forward, our political opponents are taking the easy road, carping, moaning and opposing without coming to the essence of the reform and having an informed debate about it. But this government is looking to the long term. We have to ask ourselves, how does any reform shape our future? What reforms will make Australia a fairer place? And of course, how will future generations benefit? Now, so governments do have a responsibility to look to the longer term. We have to be aware that the decisions we take today may not be obvious in their impact until they are felt by our children. I'm pretty proud to say that this government is certainly willing to take on the long-term reforms, to take them on in much the same way that past Labor governments did, and put in place a reforming agenda that is responsible for the resilience of the Australian economy today. And I just wanted to talk about a number of those reforms. I wanted to talk, for example, about the floating of the dollar some decades ago. I think there would be some in this room that would remember the float of the dollar in December 1983. That was one of the most significant economic policy decisions in Australia's history. It was a decision that was taken in the face of very strong opposition. Opponents argued a freely floating dollar would expose the economy to fierce global economic shocks, and of course it didn't. In fact, nearly 3 decades on, it has been an important mechanism that allowed our economy to deal with both positive and negative economic shocks. It has indeed been quite successful. Well, let's take another big reform put in place by previous Labor governments. Let's just look at national savings. There has been no more significant boost to national savings in this country's history than the introduction of compulsory superannuation in the early 90s. Now, at that time, there was an extraordinary amount of fear about compulsory superannuation and what it would mean for Australian businesses. Many at that stage said that it would kill the economy. Of course, it did not. Through consultation, through negotiation where possible, and a degree of consensus, the government introduced a scheme that did not send businesses to the wall. Instead, through wage restraint and appropriate transitional arrangements that were implemented over several years, Australia grew a superannuation system that is unique in the world. Far from failing, in fact, the economy thrived. And of course, as a result of national superannuation, Australians are able to retire with greater dignity and means than ever before. And now, of course, we have a $1.2 trillion industry that is well supervised, has strong integrity, and provides a vehicle for hard-working Australians to save for their own retirement. And of course, there have been many other reforms since that time. But one I do want to talk a bit about today is a current reform. I want to talk about mining tax reform. This government saw the need for fundamental reform of the way we use the wealth generated by our country's mining resources. To us, it was firstly a question of ensuring that Australians got a better return for their non-renewable resources so that we could leave something lasting to subsequent generations. Because if we don't, how do we explain to our grandchildren that we spent a one-off windfall in a single generation without thinking to leave anything lasting for those coming behind us. Our mining tax reform is integral to building the strength and the security of the Australian economy as we move forward. It's been about making sure our economy was competitive. It has been about making sure we remove impediments to economic growth. Fundamentally, reform of mining taxation has been about maximising the opportunities for average Australians. And from day one, we have said that all of the revenue from better resource taxation would be reinvested in the community through economic reform. Now, at the beginning, we expected to raise $12 billion from the RSPT, and we thought that was about a fair return for Australians. And of course, as you know, we had to cut our cloth to fit the arrangement we reached with the mining industry. And that arrangement was that we would raise $10.5 billion from the new MRRT. This means resource companies have signed up to an agreement that will deliver $10.5 billion that we will invest in better superannuation, better infrastructure, and more help for small business. A very significant advance, a great deal for Australians that will help set up our economy for years to come. This reform, like those previous reforms I was talking about before, will strengthen and broaden our economy and does have far-reaching implications. Let's just look at some of those implications that flow from this fundamental reform. What will it do, for example, to national savings? Something that is very important, not just to the dignity and the lifestyle of retirees, but is absolutely critical to funding the investment we need in this country as we move forward in what is going to be the Asian century. On the back of the resources from the mining tax, we're lifting compulsory superannuation contributions from 9% to 12%. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. But what this will do will be to provide a massive boost to our national savings pool, which currently sits through superannuation at $1.2 trillion. It will boost that savings pool by $500 billion by 2035. A very significant boost to national savings. And of course it means a strengthened financial services sector with more funds under management. And of course it does mean potential for more funds for critical infrastructure projects our nation needs to keep growing.